Dad told me there was no cake left on my birthday, yet my sister's friend got extra slices. I said nothing, grabbed my jacket, and left. They called me ungrateful. I didn't argue. My name's Mark. I'm 28 now, but telling this story still twists my stomach the way it did when I was a kid. It's funny how something as ordinary as a birthday cake can carve such a deep scar, one that lingers no matter how much time passes. I grew up in a house where favoritism wasn't hidden or denied. It was right out in the open, almost like a family ritual. My younger sister, Sarah, was the golden one, the daughter who could do no wrong. Sure, she was smart, but more than that, she was my dad's pride and joy. And me? I was the afterthought, always handed the smaller portion both literally and figuratively. I wasn't quiet because I had nothing to say. I was quiet because I figured out early on that my words never weighed as much as Sarah's. If she forgot to do something, I got blamed for not reminding her. If I did well at something, it was brushed off as chance or luck. I'll never forget this one time in middle school when I came home beaming with a second-place ribbon from the science fair. I was so proud, standing there with my certificate, grinning like a fool. My dad just glanced at it and said, "Well, Sarah will get first place next year. You'll see." That was always the way. It didn't matter what I accomplished. It was either her springboard or a joke at my expense when the family gathered around the dinner table. So when my birthday came around last year, I wasn't expecting much. Honestly, I trained myself not to. But deep down, there was still this little flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things would be different. My mom baked a chocolate cake, my favorite, but I knew it was only because Sarah hated vanilla. Family showed up, a few neighbors dropped in, and even one of Sarah's friends came along, someone who didn't even bother to wish me happy birthday. We sang, I blew out the candles, and I tried to soak in that tiny moment, telling myself it was fine, that it was enough. Then came the cutting of the cake. One slice, then another, passed out around the room. Sarah got hers, of course, and her friend, who hadn't said a single word to me, got one right after. Then my dad looked down at the plate in his hand and muttered that there might not be enough to go around. He paused, then casually added, "Mark can skip this time." Just like that. No hesitation, no second thought. The room was full, but it felt like all the air had been sucked out. My mom looked down at the table without saying a word. Sarah laughed, like it was some harmless joke. And me? I just stood there frozen, watching as a piece of my own birthday cake was handed off to someone else. I don't know what stung more, my dad's words or the silence that followed. Not one person said, "Wait, it's his birthday." It was like I wasn't even there. My throat tightened with that familiar lump you get when you want to cry but won't let yourself. Instead, I swallowed it, grabbed my jacket, and walked out the door. I heard someone call me ungrateful as I left, but I didn't turn around. I didn't argue. I just kept walking, the night air cutting against my face, my chest weighed down with years of moments just like that one. That was the breaking point, the crack that showed me how deep this pattern really ran. Walking down that dim street, away from their laughter spilling out of the house, I knew it wasn't just about cake. It was about every single time they'd chosen her over me, every reminder that I didn't matter. And for the first time, instead of swallowing it down and pretending, a thought settled heavy in my mind. Maybe I was done playing along. I didn't go back that night. I walked for hours, my phone buzzing in my pocket with messages I refused to read. I wound up in a diner on the edge of town, sitting in a booth with a cup of coffee that went cold before I even touched it. I kept telling myself it wasn't about the cake. It was about what it represented. That night was just another page in a story I'd been forced to read my whole life. By the time I finally returned to my apartment, I knew something inside me had shifted. I wasn't going to beg for scraps anymore, not in any sense. The next few weeks blurred by with me keeping quiet, in them making half-hearted attempts. My mom called once, not to apologize, but to say, "Your dad didn't mean it that way. You're making too big a deal out of nothing." Sarah sent me a text. "You were so dramatic. It was just cake, Mark." My dad didn't reach out at all, and his silence said more than any words could have. Then, as if nothing had happened, life rolled on. But I started noticing more. The way my dad's voice softened for Sarah, how he praised her for every little thing. She landed a part-time job at a clothing store, and suddenly she was hard-working and responsible. Meanwhile, I'd been working 2 jobs all through college just to stay afloat, and not once had I heard that kind of praise. The favoritism wasn't subtle. When Sarah turned 23, they surprised her with a used car, calling it a family investment to make her life easier. When I calmly asked why I'd never gotten that kind of support, my dad just chuckled and said, "You always figured things out on your own, Mark. You didn't need help." Like my independence was some kind of excuse for their neglect. I bit my tongue, but inside I wanted to explode. Maybe I wouldn't have had to figure everything out by myself if they hadn't left me stranded from the start. Family gatherings only made it worse. I began to notice how I'd become the running joke, the easy target for a cheap laugh. One time my uncle asked me how work was going, and before I could even open my mouth, my dad jumped in with, "Oh, you know Mark, still trying to figure out his place in the world." The room chuckled, and Sarah piled on with, "At least I know what I'm doing with my life." She was stocking shelves at a retail store and living rent-free at home, but somehow I was the one who hadn't figured things out. My jaw locked so tight I thought my teeth might crack, but I plastered on that fake smile I always wore. That's what I did, smiled, swallowed, kept quiet. The digs at me weren't always loud, but they cut deeper. My mom would call, asking me to come over for Sunday dinners, framing it like I was punishing them by staying away. "Your dad misses you, Mark. Don't make this harder than it has to be." And when I gave in and showed up, the script played out the same as always. I'd sit there like a guest in my own family, watching my dad shower Sarah with attention. She'd dominate the conversation, and any time I tried to talk about my job or my plans, the topic shifted like I'd said nothing. I'd leave the table feeling smaller than when I sat down. During one of those dinners, the mask slipped entirely. Sarah had been talking about wanting to move out, though I knew she hadn't saved a single dollar. My dad leaned back in his chair, looked straight at me, and said, "Maybe you could help her get started. You're doing fine now, aren't you? Just a little loan, brother to sister." I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. Sarah smiled like she'd already won, like this was just a formality. I asked, "And when exactly did I become her safety net?" My dad's face hardened. "Don't talk back. We're family. Family helps each other." But we both knew he didn't mean family. He meant me. I was expected to sacrifice, to give, to step up. Sarah was expected to take. That night, sitting in my car outside their house with my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, I realized the roles weren't random. Sarah was the chosen one, the golden child. I was the dependable backup, the one they could lean on. And as much as I hated it, I'd been playing my part for years, keeping quiet, showing up when asked, swallowing every bit of pride I had left. But that birthday cake moment had cracked something in me, and this dinner ripped it wide open. It wasn't just favoritism anymore. They were grooming me to be the safety net, the fixer, while Sarah got served piece after piece, even when there wasn't enough to go around. And in that moment, sitting in the car alone, I started thinking less about surviving it and more about breaking free. A few months later, the real breaking point arrived, bold and undeniable. One Saturday morning my mom called, her voice dripping with that sweet tone she used whenever she wanted something. "Mark," she said, dragging my name out the way she always did. "We're having a little family get-together tonight. Nothing big, just us and a few of Sarah's friends. You should come." I almost said no. Every instinct told me to stay away, to avoid the humiliation. But some pitiful part of me still held on to that fragile hope that maybe this time would be different. Maybe they'd see me, finally. So against my better judgment, I agreed. When I arrived, the house was buzzing with laughter. I stepped in with a bottle of wine I'd picked up out of courtesy and immediately felt the shift. The room quieted for a beat, eyes flicked to me, then moved on like I was background noise. Sarah's friends sprawled across the living room like they owned the place. My dad was planted in his favorite chair, beer in hand, grinning at Sarah like she'd hung the stars. I handed the wine to my mom. She gave a faint smile and said, "Oh, you didn't have to bring anything." Then she set it on the counter, unopened, while she opened a bottle someone else had brought. That familiar sting of invisibility pressed down on me again. After dinner came the betrayal. My dad cleared his throat, and everyone seemed to know what was coming except me. "So," he announced proudly, "we've got some exciting news." He looked at Sarah, who beamed, then turned back toward me. "Your sister is moving into a new apartment. We're so proud of her." Applause filled the room, her friends clapping and cheering. I sat stunned, trying to process. Sarah moving out? She hadn't said a word to me. Then my dad dropped the bomb. Of course, he added smoothly. Mark has agreed to co-sign the lease. He's doing well now, and it's only right he helps his sister get started. The room erupted again with nods and murmurs of approval, like I'd already signed the paperwork. My jaw dropped. Excuse me. I managed to say, my voice slicing through the noise. Sarah smirked at me, that smug little curl of her lips I'd seen my whole life. Don't act surprised, Mark. You know it makes sense. You're responsible. Dad said you'd be glad to help. My chest pounded, heat rising up my neck. I never agreed to that, I said firmly. Silence fell. My dad's smile slipped into that familiar look, half anger, half disappointment, the one he'd perfected. Mark, he said slowly, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. Don't make a scene. This is about family. Your sister needs stability, and you're in the best position to provide it. I glanced around the room. Every pair of eyes was on me, waiting for me to fold. That was my role, wasn't it? To cave, to play along, to sacrifice. My mom wouldn't even meet my eyes. Sarah leaned back in her chair, smug and certain I'd fold. But I didn't. No, I said, louder this time, my voice unsteady but firm enough to hold. I'm not putting my name on anything for her. She's grown. She can figure it out herself. The silence that followed felt like it was crushing the air out of the room. My dad's face hardened completely. Ungrateful, he snapped. After everything we've done for you. We raised you, kept a roof over your head, and this is how you repay us? Your sister deserves your support. That phrase, after everything we've done for you, hit me like a blow to the chest. Because what had they really done? They gave me a childhood of being overlooked, laughed at, brushed aside. They gave me a family where love only existed if I obeyed and loyalty meant swallowing myself whole. And now, they wanted me to sign away my future for Sarah's next step. Years of small cuts and insults pressed down on me at once, crystallizing into this one moment. Something inside me cracked wide open. I pushed my chair back, the sound of it scraping across the floor sharp as a blade. You've never supported me, I said, my voice low, steady, and sharp enough to cut. Not once. And now you expect me to risk everything for her? Forget it. Gasps and murmurs rippled around the room. My dad's face went red, his hand clamping down on the armrest like he meant to break it. Sarah rolled her eyes with dramatic flair. You're so selfish, Mark. It's just a signature. Why do you always make everything about you? I stared at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my sister. I saw who they had shaped her into. Entitled, spoiled, convinced the world owed her. And it hit me that the betrayal wasn't just their assumption I'd say yes. It was that they had planned the whole thing without even asking me, confident I'd play my part. I left that house without another word, their voices chasing me as I walked out the door. By the time I sat in my car, my body was trembling with rage. And I knew something had shifted permanently. That invisible string I'd been clinging to, the one tying me to them no matter what they did, had finally snapped. And for the first time, I wasn't just mad, I was finished. The drive home felt endless. Every streetlight shining down on me like a reminder that I didn't belong anywhere anymore. My hands squeezed the wheel so tight my knuckles ached, and my chest felt hollow, like something vital had been scraped out of me. Deep down, I'd always known I wasn't valued the way Sarah was. But to have it confirmed in front of everyone, to be volunteered for debt and responsibility without even being asked, that was beyond favoritism. That was betrayal. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't bother turning on the lights. I just sat in the dark, staring at my faint reflection in the window. I looked older, worn down, like a man who'd been fighting a battle he couldn't even name. The silence pressed and heavy, and for the first time in years, I let myself feel it all. The fury, the humiliation, the grief. I sat there until the sky outside started to pale, and even then, I couldn't move. The days after that blurred together. I went to work, went through the motions, but I felt like a ghost living someone else's life. Food tasted empty. Sleep came in broken scraps. My phone buzzed constantly, missed calls, voicemails, texts piling up. At first I ignored them, but eventually I gave in and listened. My mom's voice, sharp with irritation. Mark, you're being ridiculous. Your dad just wants what's best for both of you. Stop making this harder than it has to be. Sarah's text popped up next. You've always been so dramatic. It's literally just a signature. Grow up. Then my dad's blunt message. If you can't step up as a brother, don't bother calling yourself part of this family. Each word cut into me, not because I believed them, but because part of me had always wanted to. Part of me had always clung to the hope that if I stayed quiet, gave enough, maybe they'd finally see me. And staring at those messages, I realized they never would. About a week later, I hit bottom. I was at work, sitting at my desk, staring at an email I couldn't bring myself to finish. My chest felt like it was sinking, my thoughts spinning in tight circles. What was the point? Why keep trying to prove myself to people who had already written me off? I slipped into the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the floor with my head in my hands. For a terrifying stretch of time, I wondered if this was all I'd ever be. The shadow, the backup plan, the son they forgot. But as the hours dragged on, something inside me shifted. Not like lightning, not sudden clarity, more like a seed finally cracking open underground. My mind drifted back to that birthday night, to the silence after my dad told me to skip the cake. I thought about the lease, how casually they decided my future for me. And it hit me. If I kept playing along, if I kept bending, the cycle would never stop. So I began to pull away. At first, just ignoring their calls, then skipping Sunday dinners. When my mom texted her disappointment, I didn't reply. When Sarah called to scream that I'd ruined her apartment plans, I set the phone down and walked away. Each time, the guilt came, but softer than before. And in that space, I started pouring into my own life. I worked later hours, picked up running in the mornings to clear my head, even reconnected with an old friend I hadn't seen in years. It felt strange, living without their constant noise in my ear. Strange, but lighter. Still, the ache stayed with me. Some nights I'd catch myself staring at my phone, waiting for an apology that would never come. Lying awake, replaying it all, asking myself if maybe I'd blown it out of proportion. That was the hardest part, not the betrayal itself, but the way it warped my reality, making me wonder if I was even allowed to feel hurt at all. But underneath all that ache, something quiet and stubborn started to take root in me, a steady little stubbornness that kept showing up whether I wanted it to or not. I didn't know exactly what it would look like yet, only that I couldn't keep living like their catch-all for every problem, and if they treated me like nothing more than a resource, then maybe it was time I stopped being one. Hitting rock bottom wasn't just about touching the lowest point. It was the realization that there was literally only one direction left to go: up. The turnaround didn't come all at once, because it never does, but it began in tiny, stubborn ways. I started doing small, practical things that felt like quiet acts of rebellion. Getting out of bed before dawn to run a few miles and clear my head, finally tackling the mountain of dishes in the sink instead of pretending not to see it, cooking an actual meal now, and then instead of ordering junk food at midnight. To anyone else, these were boring, everyday things. But when your life has been defined by people who make you feel invisible, every small, ordinary victory feels like stealing back a little bit of yourself. Work became my anchor. I'd always been dependable, but I threw myself into projects with an intensity one hadn't known I had, breaking big tasks into tiny steps, staying late not out of obligation, but because I wanted to push myself and see what I could do. Slowly it showed. My boss started trusting me with more responsibility, and instead of shrinking from it, I leaned in. A few months after that awful dinner, I walked into a meeting expecting it to be routine and walked out with a new title: team lead. The raise felt good on paper, sure, but what hit me harder was the validation, someone seeing my work for what it was. With the extra pay came space to fix up my place. A solid desk so I could work without hunching over a folding table, framed photos that weren't just hastily shoved into drawers, a color on the wall that made me smile instead of blend in. I started inviting people over, and for the first time I wasn't ashamed to let friends see where I lived. My apartment became mine, not the echo of what my parents expected. The more I built my own life, the less their words cut through me. When my mom called to guilt-trip me about another missed Sunday dinner, the old pang of guilt still came for a second, but it passed quicker than before. When Sarah texted to gloat about the relative who'd helped her score an apartment, I set the phone down and went back to my day. Around that time, I reconnected with Marcus, an old college friend who reminded me who I had been before years of wear and tear. We met for coffee, then dinner, then more weekends. People who actually listened, who didn't roll my accomplishments into punchlines. That kind of company is strange and powerful. It makes you realize you deserve people who treat you like you matter. With each week that passed, the heaviness I'd carried for so long started to lift. I began to see myself as someone who wasn't just a backup plan, but as capable, someone worth respect. The very traits my family had used against me, my stubborn independence, my knack for figuring things out on my own, were the ones that helped me climb. Opportunities started to show up too. A senior manager pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "You've got a sharp head for strategy. Ever thought about project management?" It felt like doors I never knew were opening, and for the first time I walked through without hesitating. Still, family ties don't vanish just because you stop feeding them. My mom left voicemails full of disappointment. My dad still texted occasionally, accusing me of abandoning the family. Sarah made those passive-aggressive posts that were clearly about me. They hadn't changed, and maybe they never would. The difference now was I wasn't shrinking under it. I was growing something that was mine. Slowly, I started to understand that success wasn't just about sticking it to them. It was about proving to myself I was worth more than the scraps I'd been given. I won't lie. Part of me wanted them to notice, to understand what they'd done. Every time I thought back to that night, my dad's smug announcement, Sarah's smirk, the way they assumed I'd play along, I felt a quiet, steady fire. I didn't want revenge. I wanted recognition, not for them so much as for myself. Proof that the son they dismissed and the brother they used was no longer theirs to command. And as I got my footing, pieces began to fall into place that made me realize I had leverage I hadn't known about. One of the first cracks in their golden story came straight from Sarah. For someone everyone called responsible, her life outside the house wasn't as spotless as they believed. I heard from someone who used to work with her that she'd been skimming money from the register and quietly let go. No charges, just an awkward hush and a shift in the explanation she gave the family. Naturally, she spun it into something else. She'd quit because retail wasn't for her, and my parents swallowed it whole, praising her for having standards. That's when it struck me how much of Sarah's pedestal was built on selective stories, not facts. If the truth came out, that pedestal would crack, because it wasn't built on achievement so much as on the narratives they chose to accept. At the same time, my own career started to accelerate faster than I'd expected, and opportunities kept appearing in ways I hadn't imagined possible. The promotion was only the first step. Before long, I was sitting in conference rooms with executives, pitching ideas that didn't just get polite nods, but genuine consideration. One afternoon, my boss leaned across the table and said, "Mark, you've got a real gift for seeing the bigger picture. We're lining up a project that could put you in line for senior management within a year." That night, I sat in my apartment with the city lights glowing through the glass and felt something new settle in my chest. Power. Not the cheap kind that comes from cutting someone down, but real power. The kind that could shift not just my future, but the family dynamic that had always been tilted against me. The timing was almost poetic. Around the same time, I started noticing subtle slips from my mom. She'd sigh about how stressed my dad was with the mortgage or complain about how expensive it was to keep up with Sarah's lifestyle. At first, I brushed it off as more guilt-baiting. But curiosity got the better of me, and after checking in quietly with a few people who knew the property market, I learned they'd refinanced the house twice and were stretched thin. And then came the twist. Sarah's shiny new apartment wasn't holding up either. She'd splurged on furniture and clothes she couldn't afford and was now barely keeping her head above water. I knew because one night she texted me out of the blue. "Hey Mark, could you spot me a little cash until next month? I'll pay you back. Promise." I stared at that message for a long time. The same sister who had laughed at me, who smirked when Dad announced I'd co-sign her lease, was now coming to me. Not to him, not to Mom, but to me. That's when it started to click. For the first time, they needed me more than I needed them. My job was steady, my pay was climbing, and my independence had made me untouchable in ways they hadn't anticipated. Their golden child was showing cracks, and their own foundation wasn't nearly as solid as they liked to pretend. I didn't reply right away. I sat with it, turning it over. They had always treated me as expendable, as a safety net they could pull out without a thank you. But now, with them slipping and me standing strong, I realized something I'd never let myself consider before. I had control. And control wasn't just in refusing. It was in deciding when to say yes, and on what terms. For years, they wrote the rules. But I was starting to see that I had the power to rewrite them. The quiet fire that had been smoldering since that birthday cake burned hotter than ever. I wasn't ready to move yet, but I could see the board. I had pieces they didn't even know I held. And when the time came, the game would not play out the way they expected. That chance came sooner than I thought. Late one Wednesday, my phone lit up with my dad's name. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. His voice on the other end was different, lower, stripped of its usual command, edging into something close to pleading. "Mark," he started, "we're in a bit of a situation. Could you come by this weekend? We need to talk." A year ago, I would have jumped at the chance, desperate to prove myself. But now, I leaned back in my chair, let the silence stretch, and finally said, "I'll think about it," before hanging up. By Saturday, I drove over, not for them, but for me. I wanted to see the cracks firsthand. The house that once looked perfect now showed its wear. Chipped paint, grass gone wild. Inside, the air was heavy. Mom sat at the kitchen table wringing her hands. Dad paced, and Sarah lounged with her arms crossed, waiting like she was at a show. Dad cleared his throat, trying to conjure authority he didn't really have anymore. "We've hit a rough patch financially. The mortgage, some other expenses, things are tight. And Sarah, well, she's struggling with rent too." He gestured toward her like it was explanation enough. Then his eyes fixed on me. "You're doing well now. We thought maybe you could help us out, just until we're back on our feet." There it was, the moment they'd always assumed would arrive. Their star child faltering, their finances crumbling, and me expected to step in. I let the silence hang, watching them squirm. Finally, Mom spoke, her voice soft, almost trembling. "Mark, it's not much. You'd barely even feel it. And you know, family helps family." That phrase again. Family helps family. But family had never helped me. I folded my arms and met my dad's stare. "Interesting," I said slowly. "Because the last time you talked about family helping family, it was about me co-signing a lease I never agreed to. Or when you told me to skip my own birthday cake so Sarah's friend could have some. Or when my accomplishments didn't matter because Sarah would do better." I leaned back, letting the memories settle into the room like smoke. Funny how family only seems to need me when it benefits you. Dad's jaw worked, but no words came. Sarah rolled her eyes, muttering, "You're being so dramatic, Mark. It's just money." That was my opening. Calmly, evenly, I said, "You're right, Sarah. It is just money. And I worked hard for mine, harder than any of you ever acknowledged. So if you're asking for help, it won't be on your terms. It'll be on mine." Their faces shifted, confusion, shock, a dawning realization that the script had changed. Mom blinked, struggling. "What do you mean?" I leaned forward, elbows on the table, and let them feel the weight of my words. I said I'd consider helping, but not without conditions. "I'll help," I told them, "but only if there's accountability. Sarah, you tell the whole truth about how you lost that job. Dad, you admit you've treated me like less than family for years. And Mom, stop acting like silence makes you innocent. Otherwise, figure it out on your own." The room went dead quiet. For once, the script wasn't theirs to control. I was. My dad sputtered something, but I cut him off, steady and calm. "Yes, I can set terms. Here's the difference. I don't need you anymore, but you clearly need me. If you want my help, it comes with honesty and respect. If that's too high a price, this conversation is over." I watched them process it. Sarah squirmed, her smugness cracking. Mom opened her mouth and found nothing to say. Dad looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, as if the years of posture and bluster had finally worn thin. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and told them to think about it. I left the house, the same one I'd walked away from on my birthday with a jacket and a knot in my throat. But this time I walked out with something else. Control. The power they'd held over me for almost 30 years felt gone, and the balance had shifted. The real question now was whether they could swallow pride and ask the right way. They didn't call right away, and that silence said everything. My family wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by me. For weeks I kept living my life. Work kept growing, my management role solidified, and the raise gave me breathing room I'd never had. I spent time with people who valued me, friends who cheered, colleagues who listened. I wasn't looking for their approval anymore. Then the cracks in their world widened. One afternoon, Mom showed up at my apartment without warning, looking worn and untidy, clutching a folder. "Mark," she said, voice frayed. "The bank's threatening foreclosure. We're months behind. We need you." I let her in, sat with the papers, and flipped through them calmly. The situation was worse than even I'd suspected. missed payments, ballooning interest, debts stacked on top of debts. Years of favoring Sarah and living beyond their means had caught up with them. When I looked up, Mom's eyes were wet. "Please," she said, "you're our only hope. You've always been so strong." That word, strong, was the first time she'd ever used it about me. I set the papers down and reminded her, gently but firmly, that if I was to help it would be on my terms. Had anything changed since I laid out my conditions? Her silence answered for her. She left with the folder and tears on her cheeks, and for once I didn't follow. A week later Sarah called, and for the first time the tone in her voice was raw, not entitled. "Mark, they're going to lose the house. Dad's health isn't good. Mom's falling apart. Please, you have to do something." I let her panic land. "Why don't you handle it?" I asked. "You've always been the favorite. Didn't Dad put his faith in you?" Her voice broke. "I can't. I don't have the money. I never did." There it was, the golden girl admitting she'd just been living a story, not reality. In the end, the foreclosure went through. The house I grew up in, the place that held every slight and humiliation, was emptied and sold. Weeks later I drove by and watched strangers move in. There was a strange poetry to it. The walls that had witnessed so much of my pain now belonged to people who'd never know my story. My parents moved into a cramped rental on the edge of town. Sarah drifted between apartments that got progressively worse. Their pedestal for her collapsed, and for the first time, they faced the consequences of their choices. I didn't give them money, not out of spite, but because it wasn't my job to fix what they'd broken by design. They'd counted on Sarah to be the savior and written me off as invisible. Their favoritism is what undid them. The last time I saw Dad, months later, he looked smaller than I remembered. We stood outside for a while, the silence thick, until he muttered, "You did good for yourself, Mark. Better than we thought." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was the closest thing I ever got to an admission that he'd been wrong. I met his eyes, calm and steady, and replied, "I always knew I would." Then I walked away, not bitter, but clear. I wasn't the forgotten son anymore. I was the one who'd survived, who'd risen and built a life on his own terms. The cake, the cosign of years of being overlooked and used, none of that mattered anymore. They had lost what they clung to, and I had gained what mattered most, freedom. That, at last, was my final slice.